an infrastructure to support social falsification, from open theory to consensus statements.
In the context of a replication crisis, a period of reflection has ensued. Our system of incentives has been one subject of attention. No researcher is unfamiliar with the expression, publish or perish. It is easy to notice that publicationism drives academia, but different people identify different reasons as to why this is not ideal. From my perspective, publicationism has consequences from the way we are trained to the way lines of research take shape, which go against the need of epistemic inclusion and coordination. The first problem I would highlight is the way we frame the goal of scientific inquiry in the context of publicationism, namely, the ultimate product of science is articles and books. Whether it is because of financial incentives, the ease with which we can track their success through metrics, or any other reason, publications are the unit of achievement for the current model. Guided by this view, universities set minimum publishing requirements for graduate students and researchers. Journals and universities are ranked and assigned with social prestige and funding in indirect or direct reference to metrics that relate to publications. Views, downloads, purchases, reads and citations are considered direct evidence of successful papers and books, and of the level of influence of authors. Authors is another key word here, as this model is clearly framed by the notion of individual discovery and individual success. Why are things framed in this way? There may be many factors, but I suspect a very relevant one is that this model is quite straightforward. Easy things are easy to remember. For example, it's easier to identify Chomsky as a person than generative theory as a theory, which is a more abstract construct. Abstract, complex and nuanced ideas are not memory-friendly, which is no one's fault. It is also easier to remember a representative person of one theory than it is to keep track of the fact that theories are worked on by many people. It is easier to say postmodernism and assume that there is a general meaning of the word than it is to bear in mind such a label applies to a number of philosophers with divergent ideas, among other examples. Not only that, it is easier to simply think a bigger number of views, downloads, citations and so forth are concrete evidence of bigger influence than it is to reflect on what influence actually is. In many cases we may not be able to distinguish it from attention or fame, which are not relevant attributes in the quest for scientific explanations. Following this further, trusting metrics is also easier than appreciating it. It is not clear what the relationship between big influence and big scientific progress is. First of all, influence may be positive, or negative, or neutral. It may be productive, unproductive, or even counterproductive to the development of the field. One single experiment may not be influential, in that it would increase the H-index of a researcher a great deal, yet it could snowball into a scientific revolution, and so forth. So, even when institutions may be keen on metrics for practical and funding purposes, these achievements which are framed in terms of a quantocracy are independent of actual scientific achievements. It is also easy to lose track of the fact that views are 1-second interactions by distracted minds on a website. Downloads and purchases do not mean people have read a text. Citations can be made for different purposes, including brief mentions and harsh criticisms. Citation practices themselves are idiosyncratic, even when following citation guidelines, and thus the word citation may not be conceptually consistent enough to be validly counted, that is linearly accumulated under the assumption of commensurable units. What is the alternative? The case I make here is that the alternative is theory building and consensus building, a view through which the ultimate product of scientific inquiry is not publications, but explanations, theory. As opposed to publications which are associated with the personal success of an individual, and his or her associates, theories are envisioned here as the product of coordinated and pluralistic scientific communities. But for this to happen, we would need to change some common training and publishing practices. That is, social falsification needs an infrastructure. The first possible change is in what we should consider acceptable training practices. As Ziliak and McCloskey 2011 learnt during their campaign to educate researchers about the abuses of statistical significance thresholds, there is a lot of nihilism in academia. McCloskey was told by an economics Nobel laureate, in that he thought only unintelligent people would use tests of statistical significance, but that he nonetheless taught them because he felt students were not intelligent enough to do anything else, although he used more offensive language to make this point. McCloskey, 2012, 613, a CEO founder of a prestigious journal in economics, told her he tended to agree with her critique of statistical significance, but that young people needed careers. McCloskey, 2012-28, 49. Clearly suggesting academic careers are usually based on statistical rituals rather than scientific integrity. Krosnick 2019 provides another instance of questionable training practices.
Most disciplines value innovation and unexpected findings. At Stanford, graduate students in psychology have been taught not to waste their time publishing something that people already thought was probably true. The goal should be to produce findings that would surprise people. Researchers want to publish a lot. They want to publish novel, counterintuitive findings. They want to tell a good story.
p. 209. The need to produce impressive results to get more attention, and with it more citations, reduces the chances that previous findings will be sufficiently substantiated. This attitude has become somewhat cemented through the concept of research gaps, which has become an almost obligatory component of research papers, as opposed to replication, reproduction, or substantiation. Some will argue that gaps can be theoretical, or that the lack of substantiation is a gap of its own kind. However, this is not what many graduate students understand by gap. I have found it is widely believed that if someone else did it first, there is no gap, as if a single study were enough to prove a scientific claim. Additionally, replication is discouraged in some graduate courses, as it lacks the desired novelty value. I believe we need to stress the importance of collaboration, of the sharing of our methods and instruments, and of the need to substantiate findings. In other words, the basis of graduate training should shift from an emphasis on methodology to an emphasis on substantiation of scientific claims, which depends on solid knowledge not only of methods, but of epistemology and theory. Evidently, this should also come accompanied by an emphasis on ethical practice rather than career success. It is true we need a career, but that does not mean we should sacrifice the scientific integrity of our work to get it. Collaboration with other researchers can also have a great impact on our careers, without the need to engage in questionable practices. The second possible change that could support the practice of social falsifications relates to compulsory courses at the graduate level. I hope to have convinced the reader by now that theories are much more difficult to learn than methods. Yet as Swedberg 2015 remarks,
theory is currently not in very good shape in social science. For many years, students have also been able to take courses that give them a solid foundation in methods. And this goes for quantitative as well as qualitative methods. Nothing similar is available in theory or theorizing.
p. 14. There may actually be some compulsory courses for SLA theories out there, but it is true theory courses are not the priority in many institutions. Not to mention, we can only understand theories to the extent that we have knowledge of epistemology to interpret them. My view is that methods courses are considered the minimum requirement of knowledge, because they are the minimum requirement to conduct studies and start publishing. An alternative would be to give theories the attention they deserve as the beginning, means and goal of science making, but also to train people to understand that current methods are the result of a history of methods, that they originated in specific historical contexts for specific purposes, that some people think they have very serious limitations even if they are widely accepted and used, and some other people may envision new frontiers for those methods, that they are open to development and innovation in a direct relationship with theory, and based on a community-level scientific conversation. What would we be trying to achieve in such a change of perspective? We would be trying to find what is the minimum requirement for graduate students to contribute to knowledge generation, rather than to publicationism. For us to avoid merely subscribing to available thought collectives during our training, we need to be trained in epistemology, then theories, and only then could we confidently move on to methods, data analysis, and interpretation, all under the understanding that these last four elements are open for criticism, development, and refinement. But one problem with this approach is that it goes against the way universities are designed. We still largely follow the original British system, in which researchers are the ones who teach university courses. Professors are both research and teaching staff, and this has consequences. Learning directly from real researchers sounds like a great opportunity for students researchers in training, and it may be in some cases. But like everything, there is no single formula that can effectively apply to all cases. In a highly fragmented field like SLA, experts belong to certain thought collectives, which means that when we get trained we also get slightly indoctrinated, that is conditioned to value certain methods, theories, and pieces of evidence over others. Divided fields need a different pedagogy. One option is to value teaching staff that does not engage with research, or whose research is in historiography, and whose function is to expose undergraduate and master-level students to a panoramic view of the field. Once researchers in training know what is actually available to us, we can more freely choose which theories and lines of research we can confidently pursue for a doctoral degree. In other words, a possible solution would be to examine when it is the appropriate time in our training to move from panoramic knowledge to specialization, which would require a new format of higher and graduate education. Another problem with the prospect of compulsory SLA theory courses is that not all graduate students who move on to conduct research in SLA come from an SLA program, as these are rare, and the field is quite transdisciplinary. People come from linguistics, education, cognitive sciences, etc. One of a possible set of solutions for this problem could be open theory, which could materialize through free online resources, open access books on theory, online videos and interviews with theorists, and perhaps an open access online encyclopedia. The fact that English is dominant in academia should also entail certain accommodations for researchers outside of the Anglosphere. Writing theory books in brief and simple English, translating theory books to as many languages as possible, translating theories put forward in other languages into English. Training practices that stress the relevance of explanations over publications, and more democratic means to disseminate theories, are the bedrock for better communication between researchers. This is because we will be more open and willing to collaborate with others if instead of being trained on a few methods, we are trained to understand scientific disagreement, that there are many ways to measure or observe the same phenomenon, that there are many ways to see the same data, and to explain it. But there is still some distance between being better prepared to communicate, collaborate with other researchers, and having a system of incentives that promotes such mutual engagement. This is where the culture of publish or perish must be managed in some way until we get rid of it, if at all foreseeable. When a person engages in the process of enlarging their list of publications as it is needed under the current system, there are a number of risks: that they will cement their epistemic identity, leading to low flexibility; that they will collaborate with like-minded people for practicality and efficiency; that they take on many short-term projects instead of a single big long-term one; that they spend a considerable amount of time applying for grant after grant. At the level of the scientific community, this also means that all those grants are feeding many self-reportedly successful lines of research that do not connect or that oppose each other, which represents the funding of a costly scientific fragmentation. We must remember consensus building is not about agreement, but coordination, and pluralism does not mean division, but inclusion. In other words, we may have many opinions on theories, methods and evidence, but that does not mean we have to work separately. Ideally, after proving our line of research seems successful, and being confronted by another successful line with opposing claims, we would need to be mindful of how many resources we should keep allocating to both lines. As Boumans and Martini 2014 put it, one of the reasons for wanting consensus is purely economic.
Like all other human endeavours, also science has to satisfy unlimited wants knowledge, problem resolution, etc., with limited resources.
p. 6. In this context, the model of social falsification may have economic advantages, by allowing different lines of research to converge on a single research program, economic, meaning reduced costs for maximized knowledge. Because analogous to fast food and fast fashion, academic publicationism could be viewed as fast science, many units of lower significance in relatively short amounts of time. Fast food is bad for health, fast fashion is bad for the environment, and fast science is bad for theory building. For theories to be tested, we do not need many small papers that do not connect with each other. We need a few slowly thought out, slowly designed, slowly developed, and ultimately truly theory-shaping slow research programs. Through collaboration, bigger, longer-term and multi-team projects may be able to materialize, but for slow science to gain track, we would have to redefine the ways we assess scholars' performance and success. A great deal of large-scale advocacy throughout many years may also be needed for universities to value epistemically relevant attributes in researchers and students, rather than publications, fame, prestige, and ability to get funding. Advocacy efforts may take different shapes in particular contexts, but they would ultimately be a crucial element for social falsification and intentional pluralism to be widely practiced. Another reason why there are so many papers is the sheer scale of academia, which is so massive that thinking of coordination seems impossible. But there may be solutions for this too. Consensus statements can orient the work that is pursued by researchers around the world. Consensus statements are documents that declare the state of the science for one specific or many general issues, indicating whether consensus has or has not been reached in a scientific community at large, as well as what it would take to reach a consensus. They can also contain the agreed-upon recommendations of an organized academic community for researchers, practitioners and policymakers, whenever a scientific consensus has not been reached. Consensus statements can be written in the context of an international conference that is dedicated to epistemic coordination or consensus building. These statements can redirect the flow of papers into the areas where they are needed. Additionally, these statements can serve as a reference for a number of stakeholders involved in a number of human activities, from teachers and curricula to governments and policymaking. One additional benefit of consensus statements is that they can be disagreed upon, leading research teams to try to falsify certain claims, or leading communities to scrutinize the existing consensus on theoretical or axiological grounds. After such a process, the existing consensus may be revised, which is why consensus statements need to be put out periodically, perhaps annually or biannually, in what would effectively be a cyclic process of mutual feedback. This style of consensus building makes our knowledge more fathomable, it provides order, direction, and structure, but it also allows us to avoid absolutism, and to be open to change, structured change. To conclude, what is envisioned here is an organized scientific community, which helps inform society, while remaining open to feedback from all flanks in a context of pluralistic collaboration. Summary of propositions in Chapter 9. The model of social falsification is a response to tensions between objectivism and subjectivism that materialize in an inability of people coming from different views to engage with each other in productive ways. Criticisms to subjectivist schools are often based on stereotypical notions, as I exemplify with the case of postmodernism. There are a number of sophisticated criticisms to realism in the social sciences, which through a careful reading, prove insightful and in need not to be dismissed. I put forward an invitation to engage with schools of thought with the intention to gain insights from them, rather than to conclude whether we agree or disagree with oversimplified versions of their supposed tenets. Given the need to accept there is no universal solution to the many nuanced tensions between objectivism and subjectivism, I propose a model of collaboration between researchers of differing opinions and theories, which I call social falsification. Social falsification consists of having two opposing parties collaborate on a single research project or program, in the context of negotiation of theory, methods, and interpretation. Ideally, the effort is mediated by a third neutral party. The model of social falsification allows for negotiation, but also for integration, because it can be an avenue for minoritized researchers to collaborate with more privileged thought collectives. There is a need to define expertise in our field, in a way that is not limited to credentialism. Various groups, both academic and non-academic, have a repertoire of experiences and knowledge that can and should be integrated, if we are to devise comprehensive theories of language and of acquisition development. The inclusion of non-academics may be controversial, but there are reasons for inclusion, and ways to mitigate associated risks. Expertise can be formed by contrasting technical knowledge with theoretical criticism and philosophical inquiry into the values of diverse communities. A call for these connections and for pluralism is ultimately a call for social cognition, for effective inclusion, communication and collaboration. Our current system of incentives in academia places too much emphasis on fame, rather than quality or rigor. Methods become ritualized, a driver of publicationism, but also of the replication issues that plague academia. I put forward the notion that there should be a switch from an emphasis on publications, to an emphasis on explanations, which are the real true goal of science. Recommendations are made for the basis of research training, which I offer should be more focused on epistemology and theory, as well as on a panoramic understanding of the field, before graduate students can move on to specialization and advanced methods. Open theory is an avenue to aid the dissemination of scientific explanation through free online resources, bridging the gap between privileged and minoritized researchers. Consensus statements can aid the process of informing policy making, where an organized scientific community presents key findings, conclusions, and recommendations to decision makers. Consensus statements are proposed as revisable and periodic. Consensus statements allow for all sorts of stakeholders to provide feedback which can help the field identify the limits and biases of theories. An organized scientific community allows for better theory testing and helps society make truly informed decisions.